Now, robotics, of course, is really an extension of something we've been talking about for quite a while, which is the drive towards risk-free or risk transfer war through the medium of technology. Obviously, if you send robots into the field and they expose themselves to risks, then you are taking humans out of that equation. And we know that developed militaries are very keen to avoid military casualties. But there is, beyond that, an idea circulating that robots might also wage war better, not only more effectively, but also more ethically. The Department of Defense Deputy Secretary Robert Walk, him again, explains to us, therefore, similarly in this vein rather, that AI will make weapons more discriminate and better, less likely to violate the laws of war, less likely to kill civilians, less likely to cause collateral damage. So a net moral improvement in the conduct of war. One of the kind of strongest advocates for this perspective is the roboticist Ronald Arkham, who argues for the superior ethical judgment of machines. So he says to us that robots not only can be better than soldiers in conducting warfare in certain circumstances, but they can also be more humane in the battlefield than humans. Robots can be built that do not exhibit fear, anger, frustration, or revenge, and that ultimately behave in a more humane manner than even human beings in these harsh circumstances and severe duress. So essentially Arkham's point is that the superiority of machines in this regard is that they are entirely unemotional. They do not suffer from the emotional ups and downs of humans. They do not act out or lash out in anger or in fear. They do not feel fatigue. And therefore, they take out all this kind of messy emotion out of the process of war. And that so long as we code appropriately the laws of war into their programs, they will be better and more humane decision makers. They'll be a better enforcer of our laws of war. Note here a certain paradox, though, to say that if you take emotions out, then you become more humane, as if emotions were not one of the things that defined us as humans per se, and perhaps in what terms of what makes us humane. After all, what probably makes us humane is our ability to have empathy, to be able to feel other people's emotions. So once you take out empathy out of it, and the ability to feel emotions, and you take empathy out, it's not entirely clear how humane you would or you could be. But let's explore this idea of a coding of the laws of war, because this is critical to Arkham's view and to other proponents of robots as superior ethical machines. There is, I think, a number of reasons to question this vision of superior ethical machines. First of all, it's doubtful that the ambiguities and the contextuality of moral judgment can truly be coded into machines. The laws of war might be fairly straightforward in terms of their formulation, but when they need to be applied, they involve very difficult arbitrations about questions of priority and how to interpret or how to weigh up various principles. In particular, the laws of war often involves thinking about criteria of proportionality and necessity. And so thinking about what is proportional and what is necessary in law, it cannot be an entirely abstract decision. It has to be placed in relationship to a very specific context. Moreover, ethical reasoning does not come in any single form. It can take notably deontological or consequentialist forms. Deontological forms refer to rule-based forms of ethical reasoning that say, well, what is the right thing in all circumstances on the basis of what we think human rights are, or certainly the endowments of humans are. So in other words, you should apply these principles regardless of what the consequences might be. You act well or you don't act well. Consequentialist approaches, of course, take the other perspective. They say, well, it doesn't matter so much what the fundamental principle is in terms of how you judge an action, a specific action. What you judge is not the goodness of the action, is the consequence of the action. And if the consequence is bad, then this is not a good ethical action. The problem here is that just war thinking, which is the basis of the laws of war, is a blend of deontological and consequentialist ethics. It isn't either one of those things. It's a mixture of those. It's based on certain ideas of what proper behavior is and certain ideas of what the consequences of our actions are. And so these are quite different ways of thinking, really, and striking a balance, it will likely prove very difficult, if not entirely impossible, for an AI. I mean, it's difficult enough for humans, of course, and an AI may come to a decision, but the problem is, will we be happy to live with the decision that artificial intelligence might make? Finally, there's a kind of deeper philosophical question as well about, and that relates to an issue that we've discussed in the past, which is the idea of the moral agency of the combatant or the warrior. We remember that when we discussed this concept of the warrior, we found that one of the very important ideas behind the idea of the warrior was a certain idea of agency, the ability to act, and a certain idea of moral agency, that to engage yourself in combat, to fight people, to kill people, involved having to make certain moral determinations. And it was, under the kind of warrior code, important to act in an honorable fashion. But of course, if you remove human agency out of these decisions, you also remove the capacity for humans to act as moral actors in war. And when you think about the agency of the warrior, it's also the agency of the soldier is also an agency to go against an order. We, at different points in our history, have expected or wanted soldiers to disobey orders because we felt that the human conscience of the individual human's conscience would dictate acting against that order or refusing to take an order. And of course, we have example of this where this has happened. But of course, a machine is unlikely to disobey an order since it has been effectively programmed to carry out specifically orders. So a war that would be entirely roboticized would lose this space of freedom, let's say, where soldiers can choose to disobey their orders. This is not, of course, something that militaries would be particularly happy with in the first place, but as wider societies who might deem that important. Now, even if it is possible to endow machines with moral judgment, it's likely that their behavior will only be as moral as their programmers allow them to be. There is a well-known problem that's been emerging with the increasing use of algorithms in various areas of society, which is the issue of algorithmic bias, that systems can display unintended biases in their decisions due to the way they were coded or the data on which they were trained. So we've seen algorithms displaying, in terms of their results, on a whole, an aggregate, expressing certain forms of racial or gender discrimination, or biases under other kinds of categories, things that were not intended in a programming, but that result in the ways in which the machines have been set up, or the ways in which the data has been collected on the basis of which they were trained, or the way in which the data has been classified, and so forth. What we see is that in many ways our machines also kind of reflect some of the inherent biases and prejudices in our societies. But finally, one would have to ask, it's all fine and well to think about autonomous weapon systems that are taught to be good and to enact values that we would endorse, but what if autonomous weapon systems were intentionally programmed to conduct acts that we deem to be immoral? What if autonomous weapon systems were programmed to conduct genocide? In doing so, you would undoubtedly be dealing with systems that have overcome the problem of moral repugnance that individuals have expressed at different times when asked to conduct things of that nature. Remember, in the sessions on genocide, we found that it's not necessarily always easy to get individuals to carry out horrendous actions, and the ways in which we've generally done this, and the Holocaust is a good example of this, of course, is by abstracting the process, by distancing individuals from it, because most humans are likely to find some form of moral resistance to actions of mass killing or and attacks on civilians and so forth. But of course, a machine who's been programmed in a particular way is unlikely to feel that form of moral repugnance. So genocidal robots is something we should possibly take seriously as well. Finally, a further question arises when we think about these ethical and legal ramifications of robotic systems. Particularly if a system, a robot, an AI, is found to have committed a war crime. What then is, or who then is to be held responsible and potentially punished? The machine itself, the manufacturer of that machine, the specific programmer or designer of the machine, the last human who made a decision in the deployment of the machine? We don't have any clear and unambiguous answers to that question about how we would assign responsibility when an autonomous machine takes a decision that leads to an outcome that we would deem as immoral. The chain of responsibility is not clear at all, and our legal systems are fundamentally based on the idea that you can judge people on the basis of having taken an action for which they are responsible and can be found guilty. That is to say, we deem that they had a choice in pursuing that action. Now, if we endowed machines with legal personhood, we might be able to trial them. But if robots acquire legal personhood and some form of identity, then that raises a whole other raft of issues. For instance, do we have a right to send robots to war and to expose them to risk if they are increasingly being endowed with the same kinds of rights as human beings as well? In some ways, what autonomous robots are also doing is they're bringing into focus the fact that human agency in the first place is a much more complicated and distributed process than is usually presumed. And that legal systems that assume a kind of subject autonomy and sovereignty may well be based on assumptions that are convenient for the purposes of having a legal system designed centered around the idea of responsibility and punishment, but may not necessarily be an accurate representation of the ways in which decisions and responsibility is produced in complex societies. A second set of issues have to do with the potential geopolitical implications of the robot age. Ian Shaw speaks of a robotic US imperium in which AI and the advances that come with it would exacerbate existing traits. It would endow the US with further capabilities for global projection. It would participate in this growing dissolution of peace and war that we discussed in the previous session. But it's perhaps not so straightforward to assume that the future of robotics and AI will mean greater domination by the United States. It's true, of course, that if AI gains are nonlinear, and if certain states are capable of making particular breakthroughs, for example, to attain artificial general intelligence, this might result in very disproportionate advantages in the military fields. But it's not self-evident that this advantage would necessarily fall to the United States. China, in particular, has made a very ambitious push in artificial intelligence. In addition, AI technology, we don't really yet know whether AI technology is a technology that becomes quite exclusive, is very costly, and therefore in which certain states tend to monopolize or at least hold an exclusivity of power for quite a long time, or whether it's a technology that in fact proliferates very quickly and distributes itself to state and non-state actors. And there are reasons to think why it might be the latter. Code, which is obviously the essence ultimately of artificial intelligence and data analytics, is infinitely replicable. Very easy to just copy code. Industrial or state-sponsored espionage could probably obtain AI code quite easily. There is, of course, also a significant crossover between military and civilian technology. As I've already stated, some of the greatest advances in artificial intelligence are happening in the civilian sector. So it won't necessarily be easy for states to control that technology. And corporations may have different kinds of idea of how technology is spread. And moreover, the distinction between military and civilian technology is a very unclear one in this sphere, so that advances made in the civilian sector might suddenly be found to have military applications and be very difficult to control its spread. At any rate, it seems quite likely that in the future autonomous systems will be encountering each other in the field. And one of the concerns that arises from that is that these systems may be operating at speeds and complexities that defy human oversight and control. It will be, even if human operators and militaries are reluctant to relinquish control, the advantages given to higher speed performance and so forth will make it quite difficult to resist in a kind of escalation, a robotic escalation, which sees systems often interactive with one another at high levels of complexity and speed. Ian Shaw talks about an emergent, technologically eventful sites of security and violence, whereby complex interactions between robotic systems might take place, in which humans are, if not bystanders, at least left to run after these systems. Some have expressed a fear of the possibility of flash wars, uncontrolled escalation that might occur when systems encounter one another, perhaps in the manner of the flash crashes that have been observed in stock markets in the last decade or so, which have at least partly been attributed to high-speed frequency trading, where algorithms perform large-scale operations in the financial markets, and some combination of factors leads to some very extreme behavior and prices crashing very rapidly. Perhaps we might see similar kinds of rapid events that escalate out of control beyond human oversight happening in the military or security field. This, of course, is an area which has particular concern when considering the application of artificial intelligence to nuclear command and control, which is an area that is being explored. The idea that we should increasingly use artificial intelligence to bolster our detection systems, to prepare or to instruct and command the launch of nuclear missiles. Obviously, in these cases, some form of uncontrolled escalation could be quite disastrous. But the emergence of autonomous weapon systems does not only raise issues on the international scale, but it also raises a number of potential problems for democracy and accountability within domestic politics. The philosopher Hannah Arendt makes the point that when we think about power and the ways in which societies are ruled, we cannot understand the dominance or the power exercised within a society only on the basis of coercion and violence. Societies are governed through legitimacy and acquiescence within at least a portion of the population. Think back to Weber's monopoly on violence. Weber spoke specifically about the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force, which is to say that nation states obviously managed to monopolize, control the majority of the means of violence, but effectively what made states powerful and wealthy and stable is ultimately that large amounts of that population supported or believed in those states, bought into national narratives, granted legitimacy to the state so that the state doesn't have to use huge amounts of power in order to control its domestic societies. Arendt makes the point that even the totalitarian ruler, whose chief instrument of rule is torture, needs a power basis, the secret police and its net of informers. Only the development of robot soldiers, which would eliminate the human factor completely and conceivably permit one man with a push button to destroy whom he pleased, could change this fundamental ascendancy of power over violence. What is Arendt saying here in this text from 1970? She's saying that even in the most kinds of oppressive societies, the leadership of these societies still needs a significant segment of the society to back it up. It needs, in effect, at the very minimum, those who will carry out the acts of coercion. The security forces, the military apparatus, they have to grant some form of legitimacy to the ruler. They can't, since they are the coercers, they can't themselves be coerced. But Aaron imagines that, well, if we could imagine systems of violence and oppression that don't really require human input, then societies could be dominated by a very small number of individuals who would make use of these automatic means of coercion. Another way of thinking about this is really to note that robotics in the military sphere, but in fact also in the economic sphere, could have the effect of reducing the state's dependence on the assent of its populations. If we go back to discussions we had earlier in the year, we saw that the age of total war in the 20th century was closely linked to the extension of democratic rights and social welfare. So populations gave their support and their efforts to fighting in the military, joining in the home front, and these were keys in the major total wars of the first half of the 20th century. And unsurprisingly, as a consequence, states needed to gain greater legitimacy and did so by providing better welfare, more rights, better representation to these populations. We've already seen in the last 50 years or so that alongside the move to professional forces, the abandonment of conscription, the reduction in the size of armies, and simultaneously a decline in the negotiating strength of the labour force. So we've seen strike power decline significantly. Large parts of the economy have been submitted to, no longer rest so much on industrial labour, and therefore you can't paralyse the economy in the way that you could have done in the first half of the 20th century. And indeed, we've seen a shift away from strikes to protest as a way to try and bring about change. But the reality of protest is that while it attracts media attention and it makes noise, it doesn't really exert much more than kind of a moral pressure on governments, whereas a strike potentially paralyzes an economy and impacts the ability of business, corporations, and the state to act. As we've seen the decline in the move to professional forces, the decline in labour force, we've also seen a retrenchment of welfare provision. So arguably the opposite move that we saw in the first half of the 20th century. And if we extend that logic into the coming century, and we think of what a new age of AI might mean in both war and labour, that is to say what the third offset and the fourth industrial revolution might entail, a massive reduction in the need for human labour power, both in the armed forces and in the economy, because it's no longer just factories that will be affected by the fourth industrial revolution. It is many white-collar jobs that will also potentially disappear. So what then could the implications for democracy and accountability be? If states no longer need to placate and cater for their populations, if they can carry out their foreign policies, if corporations can remain profitable even while large amounts of the population are unemployed or underemployed, well, then we won't necessarily see the pressures for states to pay attention to their populations. As Jerris Grove puts it, at the same time that war becomes easier, governments become less accountable to their people, and people are deprived of the means to support themselves. It is also the case that people will matter less to their governments, as they will not possess the labour power to cause pain to the economic productivity of the country by means of striking, nor the capacity to refuse to fight. So what does the possible future look like? Well, in the last few years we've seen a number of campaigning efforts to outlaw or severely regulate autonomous weapon systems, notably the campaign to stop killer robots. And campaigners have optimistically pointed to precedents such as prohibitions on landmines or chemical weapons as examples that show that we can, with momentum, create a legal framing that can prevent the deployment of autonomous robotic systems in the military context. One of the ways in which they propose to do this is through a call for what they refer to as meaningful human control. The idea that there should always be a human involved in the decision to kill. Now, this is of course it's a well-intended campaign and with laudable perhaps goals, but this whole idea of meaningful human control may be one that is quite difficult to operationalize in practice. One of the difficulties, of course, here is how to identify, how to delineate what control might mean. It's true for a start that militaries are themselves reluctant to a fair extent in terms of relaxing completely human involvement, and for reasons that we've touched on already, the question of legal accountability. There is a vested interest in the military in having some human involved in the chain so that you could effectively point to some kind of legal responsibility along the way. But in practice, this human control may not be very meaningful, particularly as systems become increasingly autonomous or increasingly integrated with human decision makers. An arms control arrangement for artificial intelligence is similarly difficult because of the problems surrounding the definition of technologies and the even greater problems perhaps in terms of monitoring compliance. How will you be able to ensure that states are abiding by any treaty and are not implementing certain forms of artificial intelligence that is prohibited under that treaty? Indeed, I think sometimes one of the limitations in the debate is when we think primarily in terms of autonomous weapon systems, as if these are systems that stand outside of human agencies. We are perhaps more likely to see, certainly in the medium term, what some are referred to as centaur warfighting. Hybrid human-machine cognitive architectures, able to leverage the precision and reliability of automation without sacrificing the robustness and flexibility of human intelligence, as Paul Sharp puts it. In other words, a combination of humans and machines is likely to be the near future because of the respective benefits that humans and machines provide, the synergies that can be produced by this way, and a number of reasons why some form of human accountability is still going to be valued by most stakeholders. But of course that opens up also further down the line real questions about what the status of the human will be within the war machine. Some dream of a technological singularity in which humans merge with their machines, granting us a form of immortality through the constant renewal of our bodies or the uploading of our minds to digital code. Perhaps such a breathless view of a human ascent to quasi-divine status is overly optimistic, though, about how human-centered the future will continue to be. The writer Manuel de Landa imagines, for our purposes, a generation of future robot historians that might be surveying their evolutionary past. We may, without much difficulty, imagine a future generation of killer robots, dedicated to understanding their historical origins. We may even imagine specialized robot historians committed to tracing the various technological lineages that gave rise to their species. And we could further imagine that such a robot historian would write a different kind of history than would its human counterpart. While a human historian might try to understand the way people assembled clockworks, motors, and other physical contraptions, a robot historian would likely place a stronger emphasis on the way these machines affected human evolution. The robot historians, of course, would hardly be bothered by the fact that it was a human who put the first motor together, for the role of humans would be seen as little more than that of the industrious insects, pollinating an independent species of machine flowers that simply did not possess its own reproductive organs during a segment of its evolution. De Landa here is flipping the tables on us and asking us to think, well, what would the future look like and what would the past look like if we looked at it from the perspective of a robotic civilization who would look back and see humans as an earlier stage of its evolution, rather than from a human perspective in which we see robotic technologies and artificial intelligence allowing us to realize our human capabilities and desires to their fullest perspective. Perhaps these robotic civilizations that are imagined by De Landa will also have their own wars, and the simple truth may be that war will continue on well after humanity has disappeared from the face of machines.